They say that Antarctica is the only place on Earth where time stands still. But what if that silence, that unbroken, frozen stillness, is not the absence of history, but its concealment? What if beneath those endless miles of ice, something ancient is waiting? Not fossil, not a myth, but a memory. The kind of memory that does not belong to any living civilization, yet somehow haunts them all. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. But only if you truly enjoy what I'm doing here. And tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? I always find it fascinating to imagine how small our world feels when we whisper about its oldest mysteries together. There is a quiet paradox in the way Antarctica exists, a continent larger than Europe, yet almost entirely empty. It was the last to be discovered, the last to be mapped, and yet, in certain old documents, it seems to have been known long before it should have been. The first of these whispers appears in 1513, in a fragile parchment drawn by the Ottoman admiral and cartographer Piri Reis. His map, discovered in Istanbul centuries later, depicts the coastlines of South America and an oddly accurate outline of Antarctica, not buried under ice, but open, detailed, and familiar. It shouldn't have been possible. Antarctica wasn't officially sighted until 1820. And yet here it was, sketched 300 years earlier, with a precision that would have required aerial observation or satellite imagery. Scholars who studied the Piri Reis map have tried to explain it away. Some claim it was mere coincidence, that the supposed Antarctic coastline is simply South America drawn too far south. Others believe Reis compiled older charts, fragments copied from ancient mariners now long gone. But how could those hypothetical seafarers have known a landmass hidden under ice for tens of thousands of years? 1 U.S. Air Force survey in the 1960s even remarked that the map's coastal details match the real subglacial topography beneath Antarctica's ice cap, information known only through seismic measurements, not visible to the naked eye. And so, the silence deepens. How could a 16th century sailor possess knowledge not rediscovered until the space age? Unless, of course, he was not the first to know. The idea is unsettling, yet quietly intoxicating, that human history may stretch further back than we can bear to imagine. We like to think of progress as a straight line, from primitive to modern, from ignorance to knowledge. But the ice tells a different story. Ice remembers. It traps air from ancient ages, layers of dust and pollen, even fragments of lost atmospheres. Cores drilled deep into Antarctica's heart reveal abrupt shifts in climate, cataclysms that reset life itself. One such shift around 12,000 years ago marks the end of the Pleistocene, the boundary between a world of giants and the one we now inhabit. Mammoths vanished, temperatures soared, seas rose hundreds of feet. In the chaos, entire coastlines were swallowed. Could something else have been lost too? A civilization erased not by war but by water? Is not just maps that whisper of an older knowing. Legends from the farthest corners of the world speak of lands that fell into the sea, of cities swallowed overnight, of gods who fled to the mountains or the stars. Plato's account of Atlantis may be the most famous, but he was only echoing tales the Egyptians had told him. They spoke of a great island beyond the Pillars of Heracles that vanished after one terrible night of storms and earthquakes. The priests told Solon that this had occurred 9,000 years before their own time, roughly 11,600 years before ours. The same age marked in the ice, when something vast and violent reshaped the planet. If these were mere coincidences, they are haunting ones, and if not, then perhaps Antarctica's wall of ice is not just a geological boundary, but a veil drawn across human memory. Even now, the continent remains the most restricted territory on Earth. Protected, yes, by treaties and scientific protocols. But beneath the rhetoric of preservation lies a strange pattern of secrecy. Access is limited. Flight paths are regulated. VAR sectors are marked off limits. Researchers who venture too far from designated zones are quietly recalled. In 2016, satellite images of a triangular formation, a pyramid, as some called it, near the Ellsworth Range ignited brief public curiosity before being dismissed as a natural coincidence. Yet those who study glacial morphology note that symmetry of such precision rarely forms by accident. Perhaps it's just rock, or perhaps it's something older, carved before the ice returned to claim it. In 1958, the International Geophysical Year brought together scientists from around the world to study Antarctica as a unified global effort. It was a noble ideal, but the data collected, especially concerning the continent's subsurface structure, was classified almost immediately. Decades later, radar surveys from NASA's Operation Icebridge revealed massive subglacial lakes and buried mountain chains. One region, Wilkes Land, contains a circular anomaly nearly 300 miles wide, consistent with a massive impact crater. Some geophysicists believe it may date to the same era as the catastrophic climate shift 12,000 years ago. If true, it could mark the smoking gun of a planetary event that not only changed climate but erased entire chapters of human existence. And yet, the world rarely speaks of it. It is easier, perhaps, to look away, easier to believe that we are the pinnacle, that nothing came before us. To entertain the opposite is to accept the fragility of our narrative, that civilization may not be a rising arc, but a cycle of forgetting and rediscovery. What if those who lived before us were not primitive at all, but simply the last to remember something we have lost? At night, the polar winds sound almost like breathing. The snow moves in whispering sheets, smoothing every trace, erasing every footprint. And beneath, in silence older than language, stone waits. It does not protest. It does not demand to be found. It only waits for the world to warm, for the ice to retreat, for memory to thaw. And when that happens, when the wall of ice begins to weep, what will it reveal? The bones of mountains, or the ruins of ourselves? The map rests in silence now, locked behind glass in the Topkapi Palace Museum. A single piece of animal skin inked 5 centuries ago. Yet, when people first examined it in 1929, it seemed to speak of an age no one could remember. The Piri Reis map was strange enough on its own, but it was not alone. Other fragments of forgotten cartography began to surface, and together they hinted at a story that refused to fit within the narrow frame of known history. What if these maps, scattered across time, were the faint fingerprints of a civilization erased before the ice returned? Among them was the Orontius Phineus map, drawn in 1531, showing Antarctica's full coastline without its ice cover, complete with rivers and mountain ranges. 2 centuries later, in 1737, the French geographer Philippe Boichet produced another, dividing the southern continent into 2 land masses separated by a waterway, an uncanny match to the subglacial structure revealed by radar mapping in the 20th century. Long before seismic data, before satellite imaging, before any human had even seen Antarctica, someone had drawn it as if they had been there. Historians try to explain this away with the same reasoning applied to Piri Reis. The ancient mariners passed down distorted fragments of geography, but each explanation seemed to create new puzzles. The Orontius Phineus map, for example, shows precise longitudinal placement, accuracy that would have required a method of measuring longitude centuries before the invention of the chronometer. It was as though the cartographers were using data compiled from an earlier unknown world survey. The question grew heavier. Who or what had made that survey? Some scholars, like Charles Hapgood in his 1966 book Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, proposed that the charts were remnants of an advanced pre-glacial civilization that mapped the Earth before the poles shifted. Hapgood wasn't a mystic. He was a university professor whose work attracted the attention of scientists, and even Albert Einstein, who wrote the preface for his book, Einstein's words were cautious yet startling. He admitted that Hapgood's ideas were of great importance to everything that is related to the history of the Earth's surface. The theory suggested that around 10,000 BCE, the Earth experienced a rapid crustal displacement, moving entire continents within days or weeks. In such an event, the region we now call Antarctica could have shifted from a temperate latitude to its current polar position. It was a dramatic idea, yet some geological records whispered in agreement. Pollen traces and microfossils found in sediment beneath the ice hinted that the land was once forested, supporting rivers and plant life. Ice cores show sudden temperature collapses and recoveries, signatures of cataclysm, not gradual change. If Hapgood was right, then the ancient maps were not impossible. They were memories drawn in ink. The mainstream dismissed it. Crustal displacement was labeled improbable, the evidence circumstantial. But the discomfort persisted. Why, in that case, did multiple independent maps across different centuries show the same improbable coastlines? Why did their creators insist they were copying older sources? It is one thing to imagine coincidence. It is another to imagine a global pattern of coincidence repeating with such precision. Perhaps the deeper question was not how they knew, but what they remembered. Humanity has always been haunted by lost knowledge. The burning of the Library of Alexandria, the missing scrolls of the Mayan codices, the lost archives of the Ham Court. These are only the fragments of what we know we have forgotten. But the maps are different. They're not texts, they're coordinates. They do not speak in metaphor but in geometry. To draw a coastline is to bear witness to it. In the early 2000s, researchers using ice-penetrating radar confirmed that beneath Antarctica's 4 kilometers of ice lay a terrain of mountains, valleys, and river systems frozen in place. One of these, the Gumbutsef Range, stretches for 1,000 kilometers, rivaling the Alps. The discovery stunned geologists. These mountains showed signs of having formed long before the current ice sheet, perhaps tens of millions of years earlier. Yet they were too sharply preserved, as if the ice had arrived suddenly, sealing them in perfect stillness. It races an uncomfortable symmetry with the maps. Both preserve landscapes that should no longer exist. And in this strange dialogue between ink and ice, we begin to sense that the planet itself might be the archivist. When humans forget, the Earth remembers, not in words, but in patterns. The sediment holds traces of climates, the fossils echo vanished ecosystems, and perhaps, in some unknown way, even human ambition leaves its signature etched across time. Could there have been a seafaring culture before the last ice age capable of such global mapping? The idea seems absurd, yet fragments of evidence ripple across continents. The colossal stone blocks of Baalbek, the star-aligned architecture of Giza and Tiwanaku, the megalithic maps of the Pacific, all speak of geometry and celestial precision. Perhaps these were not isolated achievements, but echoes of a shared inheritance scattered by catastrophe. Still, no artifact directly connects them to Antarctica. Only the maps do, fragile, silent, and stubborn. Some researchers notice another pattern. Many of the maps appeared or were rediscovered during moments of intellectual upheaval. The Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the early space age. It is as if they emerge whenever humanity is ready to question the boundaries of its own history. Or perhaps, when it becomes too arrogant to remember that boundaries can shift overnight. When the Orontius Phineas map was first studied at the Library of Congress, the curator reportedly paused over its southern edge and murmured, "It looks as if someone flew over it." The remark was meant to be casual, yet there is something haunting in the image, a mind from the 16th century looking down on an Earth only we should have known. There are nights when the southern sky feels unnaturally empty, its constellations detached from the rest of the world. To look at those old maps is to sense that same emptiness, a space where knowledge once lived and then was buried. The inclines curve like coastlines, but they are also the outlines of amnesia. And so we wonder, are we mapping the world or merely retracing a memory the ice tried to erase? Somewhere beneath the white silence, a coastline still exists. Not the one the explorers saw, but the one the cartographers dreamed. Perhaps one day, when the ice withdraws and the sea breathes again, those ancient shorelines will return. And when they do, the maps that shouldn't exist will no longer be anomalies. They will be testimonies. Until then, they remain what they have always been, a quiet rebellion against forgetting, waiting patiently beneath the glass, whispering that history may not begin where we think it does. For centuries, Antarctica was the ghost at the edge of every map, an empty space labeled Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. Explorers dreamed of it, kings financed voyages toward it, but no one returned with proof. Then, in the early 20th century, the veil finally lifted. Whalers and scientists reached its frigid shores, and the last blank on Earth was filled in. Yet the moment we found it, the continent seemed to retreat into secrecy again, as if discovery had only deepened its silence. Among the stories that drifted out from that silence, one remains persistent: the strange expeditions of Admiral Richard E. Byrd. His name still lingers in polar mythology, not as a conqueror, but as someone who may have seen too much. Byrd's first Antarctic expedition in 1928 was a triumph of human endurance. His team built a base they called Little America, where they endured endless darkness and temperatures so low that steel shattered. Yet his reports from that time are full of wonder: the crystalline beauty of the ice shelves, the sense of an untouched world. He would return again and again, becoming the first to fly over the South Pole in 1929. The press hailed him as a hero. But after his later missions, something in his tone changed. Byrd's final government-backed expedition, Operation High Jump, launched in 1946, just after World War II. It was the largest Antarctic mission in history: 13 ships, 33 aircraft, and over 4,000 personnel. Officially, it was a scientific survey. Unofficially, it felt like an invasion. The operation lasted only 8 weeks before being abruptly terminated. Byrd himself was evacuated early, his reports sealed. When he returned to Chile, local newspapers quoted him saying something curious: that the United States must prepare for the possibility of attack from enemy aircraft that can fly from pole to pole at incredible speeds. The words made no sense in 1947, yet decades later, conspiracy theorists would connect them to tales of hidden bases and technologies buried beneath the ice. Of course, historians dismiss this interpretation as Cold War paranoia. Yet even stripped of myth, the facts remain peculiar. Operation High Jump mapped only a fraction of its intended area. Several aircraft crashed under mysterious circumstances, and Byrd, once a man of exuberant optimism, withdrew into quiet reflection. He would return again during Operation Deep Freeze in 1955, but by then, something in his spirit had frozen over. He died soon after, leaving behind a legacy laced with contradictions. A man who found the most desolate place on Earth, yet hinted at something alive beneath it. Among the more controversial relics of his legend is a supposed secret diary circulated decades after his death. It tells of an inner continent beyond the ice, lush and hidden, where he claims to have flown over warm lakes and forests before being taken inside a vast subterranean realm. The text reads more like allegory than fact, a dream framed in the language of exploration. Yet its imagery lingers, feeding an enduring suspicion that Antarctica's true geography may not align with what is officially known. Whether or not Byrd's diary is authentic, the timing of his expeditions coincides with an extraordinary period of global transformation. The world had just witnessed the destructive power of atomic energy. The concept of hidden forces beneath the surface, literal or political, resonated deeply. Around the same time, reports of Nazi research teams exploring the polar regions surfaced, tied to rumors of secret installations or advanced craft. Some claim these operations sought ancient relics or energy sources. Others suggested the Antarctic deserts might conceal something older than humanity. It is tempting to dismiss these ideas as fantasy, and perhaps they are. Yet history has a habit of blending secrecy with truth. After all, the first radar scans of the Antarctic crust were indeed military in origin. Some of the earliest data revealing vast subglacial formations remained classified for decades, released only in fragments. It would not be the first time governments guarded the boundaries between knowledge and myth for strategic reasons. In 1959, the Antarctic Treaty was signed, declaring the continent a zone of peace and science, prohibiting military presence and private exploitation. On paper, it is one of humanity's most enlightened agreements. Yet it also functions as a wall, legal, political, and physical. Only a handful of nations maintain access. Only certain coordinates can be visited. There are maps of the ice that remain undisclosed, digital surveys that never see public databases. In a world obsessed with surveillance, Antarctica remains strangely invisible. Perhaps this secrecy is practical. Perhaps it protects delicate ecosystems or scientific equipment. But there is something poetically disquieting about a place so large, so close, yet so forbidden. Even satellites pass quickly over its heart, their images blurred by glare or digital interference. In 2018, high-resolution photos from NASA's Landsat were mysteriously replaced by lower-quality composites in several polar regions. No official explanation was given. The mind begins to wonder in the vacuum left by silence. Maybe what unsettled Bird was not a hidden civilization, but the awareness that Earth itself keeps secrets too vast for us to comprehend. In the endless whiteness, one could easily feel that the ground is not solid but floating, that beneath the ice lies a memory of another world, whispering through seismic tremors and magnetic anomalies. Even today, researchers record low-frequency vibrations beneath the Antarctic plateau. Deep, resonant tones that pulse like the breath of a sleeping beast. Scientists explain them as glacial movement, the groaning of ice against bedrock. Yet to those who have listened to the recordings, there is something disturbingly alive in those sounds, as if the Earth is speaking in a language older than speech, and so the story of the explorers becomes less about discovery and more about listening. For every expedition that reached the edge of the unknown, the ice offered no words, only echoes. Maybe that is why the greatest explorers often ended in silence, because at some point the journey turns inward. The horizon stops being a line on a map and becomes a mirror, reflecting the limits of what we are willing to see. When Bird looked down from his aircraft, perhaps he didn't see hidden cities or alien machines. Perhaps he simply saw time, folded beneath the ice, shimmering like a reflection on water. And in that reflection, he recognized the fragility of everything we called progress. We may never know what truly ended Operation High Jump or what Bird whispered in his final interviews, but the feeling he left behind, that something ancient stirs beneath the cold, remains. And in the long stillness of Antarctica, where compasses falter and sound travels strangely, you can almost imagine hearing it, a low, patient hum, echoing from deep within the ice, a voice not of gods or ghosts, but of the forgotten Earth itself. For most of human history, ice was thought to be lifeless, a clean slate, an absence of form. But in the last few decades, instruments have begun to pierce that frozen armor, and what they found has unsettled even the most cautious minds. Beneath Antarctica's miles of ice, there is structure, symmetry, alignment, geometry that does not fit with randomness. Some call them ridges, others call them mountains. A few, whispering in the margins of academia, call them ruins. It began with radar. In the 1970s, during seismic surveys near the Ellsworth Mountains, researchers detected sharp, angular echoes, triangular forms where none should exist. At first, they blamed the equipment. Later, as technology improved, the anomalies remained. Aerial photographs taken decades later would show a pattern that seemed impossible. 3 peaks rising from the snow, each roughly equidistant, each resembling the slope of a pyramid. The photographs spread online, sparking fascination and ridicule in equal measure. Geologists insisted they were natural nunataks, peaks of rock exposed by glacial thinning. Yet others noted the eerie symmetry, the near-perfect ratios of their base angles, the way their shadows fell in unison across the ice like sundials marking forgotten time. The debate grew quieter over the years, but the images never left the public imagination. They were too evocative, too exact. And deep down, the question remained: how does nature sculpt something that looks so deliberate? In 2013, European satellite surveys recorded unusual subglacial patterns near Lake Vostok, the largest buried lake on the continent, sealed under 4 kilometers of ice for at least 15 million years. Sonar readings revealed rectilinear formations, like corridors or foundations, stretching for hundreds of meters. Officially, the anomalies were dismissed as cryogeological formations, a term as cold and neutral as the continent itself. Yet the phrase lingered in the reports with a curious vagueness, as though even the scientists who wrote it were reluctant to close the question. Later, NASA's IceBridge mission mapped gravitational variations across the region and detected mass concentrations, dense, localized zones inconsistent with uniform bedrock. One of these, located deep beneath Wilkes Land, forms a circular depression nearly 300 kilometers wide. Some researchers believe it marks the site of an asteroid impact from 12,000 years ago, the same period that ended the Pleistocene. Others whisper that the crater structure is too geometrically precise, too mathematically balanced to be a random scar. But that's where the official data ends, and the silence begins. A few independent analysts have compared these Antarctic anomalies to known megalithic geometries found in other parts of the world. The golden ratio, the 60-degree angles of Giza, the latitudinal symmetry of Teotihuacan. Of course, these are patterns we project. The mind loves order. But sometimes, coincidence starts to feel like memory. The angles repeat. The alignments return. The ice, despite itself, begins to look like architecture. If one were to strip the continent bare of ice, as it appears on those ancient maps, perhaps we would see the full picture. Mountains arranged in grids, valleys forming deliberate pathways, riverbeds bending around circular plateaus. It's a pattern so vast it resists comprehension, a kind of planetary blueprint buried in snow. Even official institutions have admitted that some subglacial formations defy current geological models. In 2018, a British Antarctic survey study of the Gumbutsev Range described it as an ancient mountain range as tall as the Alps and as jagged as the Rockies, yet mysteriously uneroded despite being over 34 million years old. Normally, mountains that old should be worn smooth by time, but these are not. They're frozen, preserved in the exact shape they once held, as if captured in mid-creation. The longer scientists study them, the less sense they make, and when something refuses to make sense, it begins to invite mythology. A theory quietly circulates in geological circles, whispered, never printed. It suggests that the ice sheet itself may have been seeded over structures too fragile to survive open air, and that the rapid onset of freezing preserved not just ecosystems but entire landscapes. This would not mean civilization, not in the way we imagine it, but it would imply design, that the Earth's surface once carried formations whose proportions spoke to something intentional, something almost architectural. A NASA engineer once described the Antarctic terrain beneath the ice as eerily regular. He was reprimanded for the phrasing later. Still, the words stayed. Eerily regular. Maybe that is what unsettles us. Not the possibility of ruins, but the suggestion of order beneath chaos. because order implies thought, and thought implies presence. Throughout history, every civilization that gazed into the void of Antarctica has projected itself upon it. The Greeks imagined it as a counterweight to the known world. The Enlightenment thinkers saw it as the final frontier of reason. The modern age sees it as a mirror, a place to hide what it cannot explain. Perhaps in some quiet way, that is why the ice remains untouched. To dig too deep would be to disturb not only geological time, but something else, something humanity has not yet decided it wants to remember. When satellites capture images of the continent's night side, faint glows sometimes appear beneath the surface, thermal signatures far from any base or volcanic vent. The explanations are always practical: instrument error, geothermal leaks, pixel interference. But once you've seen those ghostly shapes pulsing under the ice, it's hard not to think of embers, as if the Earth itself still burns with a memory it cannot release. Some ancient traditions speak of a world turned upside down, a polar inversion. In these myths, the heavens fall and the seas rise, burying the cities of the first people under endless frost. The survivors wander north, carrying fragments of knowledge that later cultures mistake for divine gifts. Perhaps these stories are not history but trauma, the human mind struggling to remember what the planet chose to forget. And now, as satellites trace invisible patterns across their hidden land, the myths begin to hum again, faint but persistent, like static across the centuries. If one day the ice begins to retreat, not by our hands but by time's, what might emerge? Perhaps nothing. Perhaps only rocks shaped by pressure, valleys carved by ancient glaciers, or perhaps something symmetrical, deliberate, older than writing. If it exists, it is not waiting to be found. It has already been found and forgotten, sealed by the same cold that preserves it. The question is not whether the ice hides ruins. The question is whether we are ready to recognize what ruins look like when they are made of time itself. There are stories older than memory, whispered through the bones of myth, tales of those who came before us and built the world we inherited. Every civilization seems to carry one, fragments of a time when humans lived beside beings of immense knowledge, architects who raised cities of stone before the sea consumed them. These are not the fables of children, but echoes that persist in the oldest records. Sumerian tablets, Egyptian hymns, Andean carvings. They speak of gods who taught astronomy, geometry, and the ways of the stars. Yet what if gods were only a word for ancestors so ancient, their shadows blurred into legend? The mystery of the Antarctic ruins, or what may lie beneath the ice, draws power from this same absence of memory. If the continent was once free of ice, as ancient maps suggest, then who might have stood upon its soil? The imagination strains to picture it. A temperate land at the world's southern edge, bordered by warm seas and rivers, now buried beneath miles of frost. Could there have been builders there? A civilization erased when the poles shifted, leaving behind only whispers in myth and geometry? Plato's Timaeus and Critias describe Atlantis not as a fantasy, but as a memory handed down through priests of Egypt. He gave it dates, dimensions, and catastrophe. A flood around 9600 BCE, eerily aligned with the end of the Last Ice Age. Critics call it allegory, yet the timeline mirrors geological truth. At that very moment, sea levels rose by nearly 400 feet, swallowing coastlines across the world. If one were to imagine a great maritime culture living along those coasts, its erasure would have been absolute. Far across the ocean, the ruins of Tiahuanaco in Bolivia rest at 12,000 feet above sea level, though geologists suggest the region was once near the shore of an ancient lake. The temple complex of Pumapunku, with its interlocking stone blocks cut to micron precision, stands as a riddle. No written record explains who built it or why. Some have claimed the site predates the Inca by thousands of years, perhaps even by a forgotten epoch. The same geometry reappears in Baalbek's trilithon, in the Cyclopean walls of Mycenae, and in the perfectly aligned avenues of Giza. The builders may differ, but their language is identical: measure, proportion, resonance. Such continuity suggests not imitation, but inheritance. Across these remnants drifts a haunting thought: that human history is not a single ascending line, but a spiral. Civilizations rise, reach a point of brilliance, and then vanish, leaving fragments for the next age to rediscover. Each cycle remembers only enough to marvel, never enough to understand. The Antarctic ice, then, would be the ultimate tomb, a library sealed by the planet itself, where the final trace of a forgotten culture sleeps beneath compressed centuries of snow. Some scientists have wondered aloud whether the rapid freezing of Antarctica could have happened catastrophically, perhaps triggered by a shift in Earth's crust or an external impact. If the land once stood in a warmer latitude, it might have hosted flora, fauna, and even people. Evidence of ancient riverbeds beneath the ice lends faint support to the idea. Fossilized pollen grains retrieved from the subglacial sediment hint that tropical plants once grew there. One core sample contained diatoms, microscopic algae that can only thrive in sunlight, dating back tens of thousands of years. If light once touched that ground, so too might human hands. But to suggest humans were there is to invite scorn. Mainstream archaeology is cautious. It builds only on what can be seen. Yet the absence of proof is not always proof of absence. The ice, after all, is not merely concealment. It is erasure. Under such pressure, a stone can flow like wax. Metal becomes unrecognizable. Whatever stood there would not have survived as monuments, but as impressions, buried topographies, symmetrical ridges mistaken for mountains. Perhaps that is why the old myths survive in metaphor instead of evidence. The flood that swallowed Atlantis, the great winter of the Norse sagas, the submerged continent of Lemuria whispered in Tamil and Polynesian lore. Each tale describes a lost world swallowed by the sea or entombed in ice. Could these be cultural memories of a single event, the same cataclysm that reshaped Antarctica and reset civilization? Modern mythographers call this idea collective amnesia, a deep forgetting encoded within the human psyche. It is as though our species once saw too much, a destruction so complete that survival demanded silence. Perhaps this is why the oldest monuments on Earth are built to endure. Pyramids, megaliths, stones aligned to the solstice. They are memory anchors, the last attempts of ancient minds to preserve truth through geometry, when words could no longer be trusted. And yet, there are traces, faint, mathematical, undeniable. The latitude of the Great Pyramid aligns almost perfectly with that of the supposed Antarctic structures. The angular relationship between Giza, Tiahuanaco, and Easter Island forms an arc that circles the globe through the very coordinates of the South Pole. Coincidence, perhaps, but coincidence is the favorite disguise of design. The vanished builders remain invisible not because they were gods, but because time itself became their tomb. We walk upon their ashes, study their echoes, and name their memory myth. Each age buries the lost, until truth hardens into geology. If the ice were to melt tomorrow, we might find nothing at all. No temples, no inscriptions, no proof. Only the faint outline of patterns that once had purpose. And even then we might refuse to see them, clinging to the safety of forgetting. Because to remember would be to admit that we are not the first to awaken, and perhaps not the last to sleep again. Somewhere beneath that frozen expanse, silence keeps its promise. The builders are gone, but their geometry endures, not in monuments of stone, but in the deep architecture of the earth itself. And maybe, in our restless search for origins, what we are really trying to rebuild is not their cities, but the memory of what it meant to belong to a world before forgetting began. The story of Earth has always been one of cycles, warmth and ice, creation and erasure. Yet among those cycles, there are moments so abrupt, so violent, that they fracture the continuity of life itself. One such moment unfolded around 12,800 years ago, at the close of the Pleistocene. The event is known to science as the Younger Dryas, a sudden and mysterious return to glacial cold after the planet had begun to thaw. But in the whispers of myth, it has another name, the Great Flood. Something happened then, something vast. The Earth, warming from the last ice age, was struck by catastrophe. In an instant, glaciers that had been retreating surged again, megafauna vanished almost overnight, and human populations scattered. The cause remains one of the most debated mysteries in paleoclimatology. Some say it was a shift in ocean currents, others an eruption of meltwater from glacial lakes. Yet another, more haunting theory insists it was the sky itself that fell, a comet or fragmenting meteor that struck the northern ice sheets, releasing an energy so immense that it reshaped the climate and history together. Scientists studying sediment cores have found a strange black layer in strata across 4 continents, a thin line of carbon-rich ash containing microspherules and nanodiamonds, the byproducts of extreme heat. It marks a moment of global burning around 10,800 BCE. Beneath that line lie the remains of mammoths, mastodons, and giant sloths, the last of the Ice Age titans. Above it, their absence is complete. The transition was not gradual, it was sudden, as though nature had been reset. If the impact hypothesis is true, then the Younger Dryas was not just a natural cold snap, but an extinction-level event that humanity somehow survived. Imagine fire falling from the heavens, the sky turning to smoke, rivers boiling in the blast wave. For those who lived through it, the memory would have burned itself into legend. It would explain why flood myths are nearly universal, from the Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh to the Hindu Satapatha Brahmana, from the Greek Deucalion to the Hopi stories of the world turned upside down. Each describes not only deluge but renewal, a world washed clean, followed by the rebirth of civilization. In that sense, the flood was never just water. It was time itself, drowning the old to make room for the new. The connection to Antarctica lies not in proximity, but in resonance. Geological studies show that during the Younger Dryas, sea levels rose rapidly, up to 400 feet in a matter of centuries, perhaps faster. Vast ice sheets in the southern hemisphere would have fractured under global stress. In Wilkes Land, scientists have identified patterns of glacial retreat consistent with sudden warming, followed by immediate refreezing, the planet's equilibrium shattering like glass. It's possible that an entire subcontinent beneath the Antarctic ice was exposed, then swallowed again in the same epoch. To imagine such violence is to confront how fragile civilization truly is. One impact, one shift in the planet's tilt, and everything built upon its surface dissolves. It's not difficult to see why ancient peoples might have seen divinity in disaster. When the sky turns to flame, what language could possibly describe it? To survive such an age was to inherit trauma deeper than memory, a fear that the world could unmake itself without warning, and perhaps that fear has followed us ever since. The Younger Dryas wasn't only destruction, it was also transformation. In its aftermath, humans adapted quickly, building new tools, domesticating crops, and founding the first permanent settlements. It's as if catastrophe itself accelerated consciousness. The sudden end of the Ice Age gave birth to the Neolithic, to agriculture, to myth. The flood was both ending and beginning, a crucible from which history emerged. But what if it was not the first time humanity had passed through such a fire? If there had been civilizations before, maritime cultures living along the now drowned coasts of a warmer world, the Younger Dryas would have erased them utterly. Only the highest mountains and the deepest myths would have survived. In that light, the legends of lost lands, Atlantis, Mu, the ancient polar cities, begin to look less like imagination and more like the fragmented memory of a global trauma. Today, scientists drill deep into the Greenland ice sheet to reconstruct that moment. Each core is a frozen diary, layer upon layer of atmosphere preserved across millennia. At roughly 12,800 years ago, the ice reveals a sudden spike in platinum concentration, a metal rare on Earth but abundant in meteorites. The evidence points to something extraterrestrial, a wound inflicted from above. And if such an impact destabilized the climate, it would have melted vast regions of the polar caps, flooding coastlines and triggering earthquakes. Antarctica's ice may have cracked open, revealing ancient valleys, only to seal them again as temperatures plummeted. It's a strange image, a continent briefly awake, breathing, then falling back into sleep. Even now, traces of that upheaval linger in the magnetic anomalies beneath the southern ice, as though the planet itself still bears the bruise. Some researchers suggest these deep scars could be remnants of impact shock or sudden crustal shifts. Others dismiss it as coincidence. Yet when the data aligns, the timing, the evidence, the myths, the silence of the scientific record begins to feel like another kind of denial. Perhaps it is easier not to ask what might have come before. To question the completeness of history is to loosen the foundation beneath our own civilization. But maybe the ice remembers what we do not. That progress is not ascent but survival. Each age rises upon the bones of the last, only to vanish when the cycle turns again. If so, then Antarctica's frozen ruins, if they exist, are not relics of another species or race, but of ourselves, of a humanity we no longer recognize, erased by the flood that rewrote the sky. And when you stand in the cold wind of the present, it is easy to forget that we are still living in the aftermath of that ancient storm. The ice that buries the south is the same that once drowned the north. The flood never ended, it only froze. Perhaps one day it will wake again, and when it does, the world may remember, not through words or monuments, but through the quiet thawing of truth. Some silences are deliberate. In the story of human history, the gaps are often more revealing than the records themselves. For centuries there have been whispers that somewhere, locked behind bureaucracy and ice, lie archives too unsettling to disclose, maps, journals, and reports that tell a version of our world too ancient, or too strange, to fit into the narrative we are allowed to keep. When it comes to Antarctica, that silence feels almost institutional, as though the continent itself has been placed under an unspoken embargo of truth. After World War II, scientific exploration entered a strange new phase. Expeditions were no longer driven purely by curiosity, but by the quiet shadow of control. Operation High Jump, once heralded as a heroic adventure, ended in secrecy. Operation Deep Freeze followed, cloaked in military collaboration. Then, in 1959, as if on cue, the Antarctic Treaty was born, a document that seemed noble in its intent, promising peace, cooperation, and scientific freedom. But behind the language of unity, there was something peculiar. It was the first international treaty in history to ban not just war but access. Under its terms, no nation could claim ownership, no resource could be mined, and, more importantly, no private citizen could freely explore the continent without state permission. It was as though the entire landmass had been placed under quarantine indefinitely. The world's superpowers, the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom, all agreed to this instantly, even at the height of the Cold War. Nations that could not agree on the color of the sky somehow agreed that Antarctica must remain untouched. The question is why? Some historians argue it was a matter of scientific protection, a gesture to preserve ecosystems, to prevent conflict over resources. But others sense something colder in the subtext, an unspoken understanding that what lies beneath the ice is not merely geology. Declassified fragments from the 1960s mention unusual formations discovered by seismic teams, then abruptly redact the details. Soviet missions in Queen Maud Land collected magnetic readings that never appeared in public archives. U.S. Navy flights photographed circular depressions hundreds of miles inland. The images vanished from open record. In 1978, a British geologist published a brief note about mass anomalies suggestive of hollow structures. His paper was quietly withdrawn, and somewhere, in the vaults of the Vatican Library, there is said to be a correspondence from 1515 between Pope Leo II and a Portuguese explorer, describing a southern continent rich in marble and ruins. The letter, though referenced in early inventories, is missing from the collection today. No copy has ever surfaced. Of course, skeptics dismiss all of this as the natural entropy of record-keeping. Papers lost, data misplaced, conspiracy born from coincidence. But there is something poetic, even archetypal, about the idea of forbidden knowledge. Every civilization seems to guard its own secret archive. The Library of Alexandria burned. The Mayan codices were hidden. The Dead Sea Scrolls were buried in caves. Perhaps suppression is the natural defense of truth when it threatens to unravel certainty. In the modern world, that suppression has simply evolved, shifting from flames to classification stamps, from papyrus vaults to digital locks. Data can disappear quietly now, without the need for fire. And yet every so often, something leaks through. A radar image, an accidental coordinate, a scientist's cryptic comment in a conference transcript. Each fragment alone means nothing. Together they form a pattern too consistent to ignore. The pattern suggests awareness, that the silence around Antarctica is not absence but design. It would not be the first time knowledge has been controlled. The early church, after absorbing the pagan schools of Alexandria, systematically filtered the ancient texts it could not reconcile with doctrine. The Gnostics spoke of hidden realms of creation, mirrored in the heavens and the poles. Their writings vanished under the Inquisition. During the Renaissance, explorers were sponsored not just to find gold, but to retrieve forgotten maps. Even Newton, whose calculations redefined the cosmos, spent half his life studying alchemy, a pursuit his biographers later erased from his legacy. History is less a record of discovery than a curation of what must be remembered. If the archives of Antarctica exist, whether in Vatican vaults, military basements, or unmarked data centers, they likely contain the same thing all forbidden knowledge holds: context. Proof that our story did not begin in Mesopotamia or Egypt, but much earlier, in a world now buried beneath the sea and the ice. The concept of catastrophic amnesia appears again in anthropology. The idea that civilizations collapse so completely that even memory itself dies. Perhaps those who survived the last reset left records knowing they would not be believed. Perhaps they carved them in stone, or encoded them in myth, or hid them in the one place guaranteed to remain untouched: the pole. And maybe that is why the Antarctic Treaty endures unchallenged. Because if the ice melts, and something emerges that redefines our past, every structure of belief, political, religious, scientific, would tremble. Even now, whispers persist among certain research groups about sensitive discoveries withheld from publication. A glaciologist from Norway once admitted in a private letter that her team had been ordered to destroy core samples containing organic fibers inconsistent with expected epochs. She never published again. When knowledge becomes too dangerous, it's not erased. It is buried. The Vatican has done it with theology. Empires have done it with conquest. And perhaps the planet itself has done it with ice. Maybe the archives are not even human. Maybe the Earth keeps its own record. In the magnetic lines, in the fossilized air, in the layered pressure of snow that has never seen light. The continent beneath the ice could be the lost library of a forgotten age, its pages sealed not by monks or generals, but by time itself. And if those pages were ever opened, what language would they speak? Would we recognize the handwriting of our ancestors? Or would it feel alien, the voice of a humanity we've already become and lost again? The silence of Antarctica is not just geographical, it is psychological. It reminds us that ignorance is a kind of comfort, and that truth, once thawed, has a way of flooding everything. Across the planet, there are patterns that seem to hum with the same quiet rhythm. Geometric alignments so precise they defy coincidence. From the standing stones of Karnak to the pyramids of Egypt, from the Nazca lines carved into desert rock to the sunken ruins off the coast of Yonaguni in Japan, geometry has followed humanity like a forgotten language. But what if it wasn't humanity that invented it? What if we only inherited it? Fragments of a code written long before the first civilization began to count its days. Antarctica, in this light, becomes more than a landscape of isolation. It becomes a node in an invisible network, a cold mirror reflecting structures scattered across the Earth. Beneath the miles of ice, radar surveys have revealed repeating formations, linear ridges, concentric circles, and intersecting valleys that resemble ancient city grids distorted by time. Scientists insist these are natural glacial features formed by pressure and flow. Yet when the coordinates of these formations are compared to the great megalithic sites of the world, curious symmetries appear. Trees. It's as if the same mathematical hand brushed across continents, a lattice of sacred geometry stitched into stone, soil, and ice. In the 1970s, engineer Bruce Cathy proposed that the Earth's magnetic field forms a global energy grid, a matrix of intersecting lines connecting key points such as Giza, Easter Island, and the poles. His theories were dismissed as pseudoscience, yet decades later, satellite mapping of magnetic anomalies revealed a startling fact. Energy flux patterns on Earth do indeed concentrate along mathematically predictable lines, and at several of these intersections, ancient monuments stand as if deliberately placed. Could it be that our ancestors sensed the invisible architecture of the planet, the same geometry that hides beneath Antarctica's frozen crust? Or is the repetition of patterns simply the echo of our own desire for meaning? To the ancients, geometry was not mathematics, it was theology. A circle represented eternity, the triangle the union of heaven and earth, the spiral the rhythm of creation. To carve those symbols into the world was to converse with it, to leave markers for the divine, and perhaps, if the legends are to be believed, those symbols were once shown to them by beings who came from the south, from the land beyond the storms. Some have speculated that the myths of the Shining Ones, the architects who brought knowledge to early humanity, could trace back to a civilization destroyed in the last cataclysm. These tales appear across cultures: the Egyptian Thoth, the Mesopotamian Awans, the Andean Viracocha, Polynesian Tangaroa, all teachers who emerge from the sea after a great flood, bearing geometry, agriculture, and law. Their depictions vary, yet one detail recurs: they came from a distant cold land, now gone. Could that land have been the Antarctica of another age before the ice sealed its libraries? Of course, to modern minds, such speculation is myth wrapped in fantasy. But myth, when examined closely, behaves like a fossil. The soft flesh of story decays, leaving behind the hard imprint of something once alive. The mathematical correspondences between these myths and the physical world cannot be easily dismissed. Even in Antarctica's most remote datasets, the geometry endures. A 2012 study from the European Space Agency, mapping gravitational variations, revealed polygonal distributions under the ice that mirror tessellations seen in basalt columns, like those of the Giant's Causeway in Ireland, formations born of cooling and contraction. Yet some of these Antarctic polygons stretch for miles, far larger than natural crystallization allows. They appear aligned not randomly but directionally, oriented toward the magnetic pole. Nature, it seems, prefers chaos. Symmetry implies intent, and intent, even if we cannot name its maker, suggests intelligence. If such formations exist, they may not be buildings in the way we imagine. They could be remnants of acoustic architecture, structures designed to interact with sound, magnetism, or vibration. The ancients understood resonance intuitively, the way a drum beat can stir sand into sacred patterns, the way a chant can fracture stone. Archaeologists studying ancient temples in Egypt and Malta have noted acoustic anomalies, frequencies that amplify human voice, echoing like the heart of an instrument. It's possible that what we now call architecture once functioned as technology, a means of communication with the planet itself. Antarctica, as the planet's most magnetic region, would have been the logical center of such a system. If an ancient culture sought to harness the Earth's resonance, it would have built its anchor there, at the pole, where all lines of energy converge. And if that civilization fell, the ice would have entombed not just its monuments, but the global network that once connected them. We may still feel traces of that connection today, not as technology, but as intuition, the human fascination with symmetry, with the perfection of form. When we build cathedrals or design equations, perhaps we are unconsciously echoing a pattern that predates history. The golden ratio, P, Fibonacci spirals. They're not inventions, but rediscoveries, fragments of a universal blueprint. The more one looks, the more the planet begins to resemble a single design, half erased. The ancient sites of the world seem less like isolated miracles, and more like fragments of a unified map, one that once spanned from pole to pole. The poles themselves, perhaps, were the anchors of that system, the bookends of a forgotten world, and so the ice remains not merely frozen water, but frozen geometry, a white veil stretched across the face of the oldest architecture on Earth. The lines are still there, running beneath, intersecting in silence. The Earth remembers its own design, even if we no longer do. If we could see it all at once, every monument, every lay, every magnetic trace, the pattern would emerge like a constellation, vast and ancient. It would not point to heaven, but inward, toward the memory of the planet itself. Perhaps that is the true function of the Antarctic ice, not to conceal, but to preserve the pattern until we are capable of seeing it again without destroying it. Until then, the geometry sleeps, perfect, patient, and cold. Some knowledge survives not because it was written down, but because it was guarded. In every age there have been those who sense that truth is too fragile for public display, that once revealed, it risks distortion, corruption, or erasure. These guardians of forgotten history do not always appear in robes or rituals. Sometimes they wear the lab coats of scientists, the uniforms of explorers, or the plain anonymity of bureaucrats. The shape of secrecy changes, but its function remains constant, to protect the memory of the world from the world itself. Antarctica, more than any other place on Earth, feels curated, not by nature, but by silence. Its treaties, its boundaries, its limited access all serve to maintain that silence. And yet, now and then, fragments surface, the hint of an unusual photograph, a classified memo, a whistleblower's story whispered online before disappearing. They come and go like static, glimpses of something larger that never quite resolves into view. Perhaps that is intentional. There is an idea, one that haunts both myth and science, that certain truths can only exist if they remain partially hidden. Ancient cultures understood this well. In Egypt, sacred knowledge was divided into two streams, the exoteric for the people and the esoteric for the initiated. What was revealed was only the surface. The deeper meaning, the geometry of the gods, was kept in the inner temple, guarded by a class of priests who swore to silence. Their role was not to hoard knowledge, but to preserve its sanctity, to keep it from those who would wield it carelessly. It is tempting to believe that such a priesthood still exists, though in another form. Some say the custodians of the old world never vanished. They simply changed names, becoming archivists, scholars, and governments, each guarding a fragment of the same inheritance. Perhaps that inheritance is not merely spiritual, but literal. Data, artifacts, or records of a civilization that predated our own. The Vatican has long been suspected of holding manuscripts that contradict accepted chronology, documents referring to pre-Diluvian kings or technologies beyond their supposed era. During the Renaissance, papal astronomers were rumored to have drawn maps of a southern continent based on ancient sources, centuries before Antarctica was officially discovered. The Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher even published a map in 65 showing Terra Australis, marked with curious symbols resembling concentric cities. It was never explained where he found his reference. In the modern age, the keepers of hidden knowledge have taken on new faces. Intelligence agencies conduct satellite surveys of Antarctica under the pretext of climate observation. Private contractors build research stations whose data never reaches public databases. Even space agencies occasionally detect anomalies that vanish in subsequent reports. The pattern is subtle but familiar: discovery followed by silence. What could be worth so much secrecy? Perhaps it is nothing more than the inertia of power. Information is the currency of control. If there truly is evidence of an older chapter of human history, an epoch that challenges our understanding of civilization's origin, then the revelation would be destabilizing. Religions would have to be rewritten, scientific models recalibrated, entire industries of belief dismantled. To guard such a revelation would be, in some sense, an act of mercy. And yet, suppression breeds curiosity. The more knowledge is hidden, the louder its absence hums. Those who listen too closely often find themselves silenced, not through violence, but through discrediting. A scientist labeled eccentric, a pilot dismissed as delusional, a researcher quietly removed from their post. These are the soft edges of control, subtle enough to escape history's notice, but effective enough to preserve the silence. A notion of custodianship appears in myth as well. In Tibetan lore, the Shambhala monks guard a library beneath the mountains containing all the wisdom of prior ages, accessible only to those who have transcended greed. In Islamic mysticism, the Hafidh al-Zaman, the keepers of time, are said to record every rise and fall of civilization in invisible script, ensuring that nothing is truly lost. And in the West, Freemasons spoke of the light in the north, a metaphor for the place where divine architecture still sleeps. Perhaps these stories are the same truth expressed through different tongues, a recognition that knowledge and responsibility are inseparable. The modern mind, impatient and empirical, struggles with such ideas. But even science has its own hidden custodians. Consider the classified archives of the Cold War, the deep ocean data from Project Azorian, the lunar samples locked away since Apollo 17, or the undisclosed research into climate anomalies beneath the poles. Governments justify their secrecy as national security, yet each withheld discovery delays a reckoning. To know too soon, they say, is to unravel stability. But stability is a fragile virtue when built on forgetfulness. Every civilization that has risen believed itself permanent. Every one of them is now dust. Perhaps the custodians understand this. Perhaps their silence is not tyranny but timing, waiting until humanity is ready to confront the magnitude of its own history without destroying itself. The Antarctic ice, with its vast and quiet patience, mirrors that restraint. It conceals not to deny, but to preserve. If the legends of buried structures, ancient maps, and forbidden archives hold any truth, then what sleeps beneath is not meant to be exposed by greed or curiosity, but by necessity. There is something humbling in that, the idea that we are being allowed to forget, for now, that somewhere a record endures, untouched, awaiting the right moment to be remembered. And perhaps when the world grows restless again, when the ice begins to melt and the balance tips once more, those custodians will step out from the shadows, not as masters, but as witnesses, to remind us that the earth too has its own librarians. For now they wait, as all things beneath the ice do. And the silence continues its vigil. There are places on Earth that feel less like geography and more like memory. Spaces where time moves differently, where the air itself seems to listen. Antarctica is one of them. Standing at its edge, one senses not emptiness, but density, a weight of silence that seems older than the continents themselves. It is as though the world once spoke here, then chose to fall quiet. Beneath that silence lies everything we have forgotten: lost civilizations, lost climates, and perhaps lost selves. For centuries we have looked at the white expanse and seen only void. But ice is never empty. It is the slowest storyteller on the planet, a keeper of epochs, compressing centuries into crystal. In every frozen layer lies a memory of air once breathed, storms once raged, fires once burned. The ice has witnessed extinctions, reversals of the magnetic poles, even the birth of language. It remembers what the living cannot. Scientists who drill into the heart of the Antarctic sheet describe a strange feeling when the core rises from the borehole, a column of ancient atmosphere sealed in silence for hundreds of thousands of years. As it thaws, it exhales the breath of an older Earth. Some say they can smell the faint trace of forests that no longer exist. Others, in the privacy of their journals, admit to a kind of awe tinged with grief, as if the planet itself were whispering through those tiny bubbles of air, reminding us how small our century really is. The farther they drill, the more the story bends. The data shows sudden leaps in temperature, inexplicable spikes in greenhouse gases, sharp reversals in magnetism, disruptions that repeat in cycles, like the heartbeat of a world constantly reborn. In those fluctuations, one can almost see the outline of forgotten civilizations rising and vanishing, their existence erased not by conquest but by time's own hand. And still, the ice endures. The mythic imagination once saw Antarctica not as a wasteland but as the mirror of paradise, the antipode to Eden, where divine secrets were hidden after humanity's fall. Medieval alchemists believed it was the resting place of prima materia, the original substance from which creation began. In Hermetic tradition, it was the world beneath the world, a realm of pure memory preserved in crystalline form. Even today, mystics speak of the pole as the Earth's crown chakra, a site of silence where all vibrations converge. It is easy to dismiss such ideas, but there is poetry in their persistence. Somehow, across millennia, the human mind has sensed that the planet keeps its memories in the cold. Modern instruments may prove what myths once intuited. Beneath the ice, radar mapping has revealed networks of rivers still flowing in darkness, entire ecosystems sealed off from the sun for millions of years. Bacteria sleep there, untouched since the age of the dinosaurs, carrying genetic codes that predate mammals. Every sample recovered is a time capsule, a fragment of a world we thought extinct. Some researchers even speculate that these microbial vaults could hold answers about evolution, resilience, and perhaps the very origins of life. If such endurance exists in organisms, could memory itself also persist? Not in DNA, but in vibration, in structure, in the alignment of atoms held still by cold. Quantum physicists speak of coherence, the strange ability of matter to retain traces of its previous states. Perhaps the Earth remembers in ways we have yet to measure, storing not only its chemical history but its emotional one. When we speak of ruins beneath the ice, maybe we are misnaming the phenomenon. Perhaps there are no temples, no monuments, no lost cities carved in stone, only the imprint of consciousness, the fossil of an age when humanity lived differently, in rhythm with the planet instead of above it. If such a trace exists, it would not appear on radar or satellite imagery. It would appear only in resonance, the way a melody lingers after the last note fades. And yet, the human mind keeps searching for shapes, pyramids, corridors, walls, because we recognize ourselves in geometry. We crave evidence that we once mattered, but maybe the truth is subtler. Maybe the ruins of the ancient world are not built things at all, but preserved frequencies, memories of thought frozen into form, waiting to thaw when the planet warms again. In that sense, the coming melt is not merely environmental, it is historical. As temperatures rise, as glaciers recede, the past begins to breathe again. Ancient air escapes into modern lungs. Viruses dormant for millennia awaken. Ice cores yield secrets of extinct climates and forgotten catastrophes. The Earth is slowly reopening its archives. Each droplet of meltwater is a word returning to the global conversation. But the question remains, are we listening? Humanity's attention drifts easily to spectacle, to noise. We measure progress in speed, not depth. The ice, however, measures impatience. It does not rush to reveal. Its lessons are long, its truths quiet. To hear them requires stillness, humility, qualities our civilization has nearly unlearned. Perhaps that is why the continent remains closed, why the treaties endure. We are not yet ready to hear what the ice remembers, and yet, one day, we will. Whether by our own hands or by the slow turning of the planet, the wall of ice will yield. When it does, it will not shout its revelations, it will whisper them, as it always has. In the trickle of meltwater, in the glimmer of light refracted through crystal, in the strange warmth rising from beneath the permafrost, there the past will speak. And when it does, we may find that what we called the ancient world was not a different civilization at all, but an earlier version of ourselves, a humanity that once knew how to remember. Until then, the ice waits. It is not our enemy or our frontier. It is the world's last act of mercy, holding safe what we have forgotten, guarding it in stillness, until the noise fades enough for us to listen. And when we finally do, we may realize the truth was never lost. It was only waiting, cold and patient, for us to grow quiet enough to hear it again.